Hello, dear friends. Today we continue our acquaintance with the memoirs of Waffen SS Major General Kurt Meyer. Don't forget to rate the video and leave your opinion about this material. Well, let's begin. On June 19th, I received an order to reconnoiter the road. At dawn, my vanguard advanced through wooded and hilly terrain, clearing the way with cannon and machine gun fire. The retreating French units again attempted to create a defensive line to buy time. These attempts no longer bothered us much. We had only one goal: to advance further south. The flanks were no longer important. We moved along the roads like a fire-breathing dragon. We could not stop. Fire was only directed from combat vehicles and motorcycles on the move. Our advance began to resemble a wild hunt. Around 10 in the morning, we reached a small hill and looked down on Porsen. I was moving with the advance guard and saw French soldiers struggling to erect a barricade on the road at the entrance to the town. The terrain on both sides of the road was open, and the road sloped downhill for about 800 meters in the direction of Porsen. These unfavorable terrain conditions prevented a proper attack on the town. Therefore, I decided to take the French by surprise and capture their positions with a lightning attack. For this surprise attack, I chose the advance unit under the command of SS Obersturmführer Knittel. I ordered the rest of the attacking platoon to follow 100 meters behind and provide covering fire for the advance unit. The French still had no idea that we were already so close to Porsen. They were calmly gathering whatever materials they could find to barricade the entrance to the town. Suddenly, our first motorcycle with a sidecar rolled down the hill and, like lightning, jumped onto the road, firing as it went. The other motorcycles followed at full speed. Armored vehicles followed on both sides of the road, firing their 20mm automatic cannons, clearing the way for the advancing motorcyclists. Mortars pounded the city. In just a few seconds, all hell broke loose. I hurried after the advance unit and saw frightened French soldiers running in panic from their houses into the street. Officers gesticulated frantically, trying in vain to get the soldiers to fight. The shock was too great, and effective defense was no longer possible. Only bullets from isolated rifle shots whistled over our heads. In a short time, a breach wide enough for us to pass through was made in the French barricade. A 75mm gun had been installed there by the French, but its crew did not have time to open fire, so quickly did our advance units act. However, the enemy's initial confusion passed, and it was no longer advisable to continue the attack with vehicles. We now advanced on both sides of the road in a combat formation, on foot. Turning onto the main street of the city, we were met with intense machine gun fire, which forced us to be cautious. But we could not delay any longer. The attack had to be carried out as quickly as possible to prevent the bridge at the far end of the city from being blown up. The advance platoon rushed toward the bridge in short bursts. The French prisoners ran back, trying to leave the danger zone. 50 meters from the bridge, the commander of the assault group, SS Obersturmführer Knittel, was wounded in the thigh and barely managed to take cover behind a large elm tree before debris from the bridge blown up by the French flew around us. As soon as the smoke cleared a little, we were met with fierce fire from the French infantry. The opposite bank of the Soule River was slightly higher, which created excellent conditions for defense. In the current situation, we remained on the occupied line, and I asked the battalion following us to bypass Porsen and try to capture the bridge over the Soule River about 12 kilometers to the south. Meanwhile, behind the blown-up bridge, the enemy felt safe and had no idea that their complete defeat was imminent. At 2 p.m., Jochen Peiper, commander of the vanguard company of the 3rd Battalion of the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, reported that the crossing over the Soule had been completed. To top it off, an enemy company was captured with all its military equipment. The 3rd Battalion of the Leibstandarte was hastily ferried across the river and launched an attack on Porsen. The battalion attacked the French from the rear and was able to complete the battle without significant losses. My vanguard left St. Porsen and pursued the enemy to Ghana. By 4 o'clock, Ghana had been taken without a fight, and we began to conduct reconnaissance in the direction of Vichy. Heavy tree barricades on the Ghana-Vichy road prevented us from completing our task before nightfall. Shortly before reaching Vichy, we took an artillery unit by surprise. Its outdated trucks were unable to climb a steep hill. The guns were obviously left over from World War I and, of course, were of little use. They had probably been in storage somewhere until then. The motorized rifle company successfully disarmed the French without suffering any losses and sent them back to Gnou on foot. A demoralized French officer stood on the road, staring gloomily at the guns. I saw tears streaming down his cheeks. He stammered, "What a shame. The soldiers of Verdun should not have allowed this to happen." We found that the bridge over the Aisne was intact and made contact with the German troops who had occupied Vichy. On June 19th, 17 officers and 933 soldiers were taken prisoner. All the prisoners looked exhausted and demoralized. On June 29th, the 2nd Battalion of the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler reached the city of Clermont-Ferrand and captured 242 aircraft of various types at the airfield. We captured 8 tanks, numerous vehicles, and other equipment. In addition, the battalion took a major general, 300 officers, and 4,000 soldiers prisoner. A French captain, captured immediately after the start of the attack at Pont du Château, volunteered to be a negotiator. Despite his white flag, he was shot dead by French soldiers when he approached the French positions to ask for the surrender of the so-called open city. On June 23rd, our vanguard moved towards Saint Etienne and, 2 kilometers north of La Fouilleuse, came under sporadic fire from behind barricades on the road. The advance unit drove into the undergrowth on both sides of the road and attempted to reconnoiter the approach to the far end of the barricades. I was moving along the ditch with the 2nd platoon and had barely passed the anti-tank barriers when intense fire began and a tank rolled out from behind the barricade. It moved across the open space, firing. We huddled at the bottom of the anti-tank ditch like rabbits and watched the approaching steel monster. Half dead, we watched as the tracks moved closer and closer to the edge and seemed to slip down into the concrete ditch. Finally, the tank stopped right above us, just before the slope of the ditch. The tank and our anti-tank gun engaged in a duel at a distance of only 20 meters from each other. The anti-tank gun fired first, and after a loud bang we heard the piercing whistle of a ricocheting shell. But the second shell also failed to penetrate the tank's armor. It was too thick for the shells of our 37mm gun. We saw the tank roll straight towards the anti-tank gun and fire point-blank at the gun crew. Just a few meters short of the destroyed gun, the tank turned around and returned behind the barricade. We were relieved to see that the second shell had jammed the tank's turret and the crew could no longer aim the gun properly. Unfortunately, 3 tank destroyers from the anti-tank gun crew were killed. They were the last of our soldiers to die in the French campaign. From the position of the advance unit, I could see a total of 6 enemy tanks hiding behind the barricades. They were veterans of the First World War, built for the planned and failed offensive of 1919, and had never seen combat. Half an hour later, the tanks were forced to retreat under fire from our 150mm guns. The road to Saint Etienne was open. The next morning, the 1st Battalion of the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Regiment entered the city and captured several hundred more French soldiers. At 9 o'clock in the evening on June 24th, we learned that a truce had been concluded between Italy and France, although the truce between Germany and France had been signed 2 days earlier, on June 22nd. The fighting in France was over. Was this the end of the war? The armistice agreement established a demarcation line, and on July 4th we had to withdraw from the occupied territory to the north. Then our regiment was transferred to the command of the 12th Army and left for Paris early in the morning. We were to take part in the upcoming parade. Despite the defeat suffered by the French army, the French population was quite welcoming. Shortly before reaching Paris, we learned that most of the French fleet had been sunk or captured by British ships in the ports of Oran, Dakar, Alexandria, and others. This deeply shocked the French. Never before and never since have I seen so many people crying as I did then in France. Churchill's actions were seen not as military action, but as a crime. Paris was surrounded by a tight ring of von Briesen's division. The city center could only be entered with permission and a pass from headquarters. My soldiers and I took the opportunity to see the sights of Paris. Since the planned parade was first postponed and then finally canceled, the regiment left Paris and moved to Metz. I asked Sepp Dietrich for permission to leave 24 hours early to show my soldiers the blood-soaked battlefields of World War I at Verdun. The Battle of Verdun lasted from February 21st to December 18th, 1916, and cost the Germans 600,000 dead and wounded, and the French 358,000. Permission was granted, and on July 28, 1940, about 100 soldiers gathered at Fort Douaumont. Together, we made our way through the casemates that had been taken by brave Brandenburg Grenadiers 24 years earlier. We stood, deeply impressed, in front of a huge casemate, whose gates were walled up and behind which countless German soldiers found eternal rest. The ravaged earth in the area around the ruined Fort Douaumont spoke for itself. Rows of craters, a lunar landscape. The short grass could not hide the suffering of this land. Trenches crisscrossed the terrain like deep wrinkles. Between Fort Douaumont and the casemate crypt, we discovered the fresh grave of our fallen comrade, who had lost his young life just a few weeks earlier. With our heads bowed, we stood at this abandoned grave and looked at the countless graves to our left. Thousands and thousands of wooden crosses stood in neat rows. Words were powerless to express what we were feeling. Here were invisible regiments, whose former existence was marked by crosses. From the casemate crypt, we slowly climbed up to Fort Vaux and tried to imagine the incredible efforts of the German and French soldiers who lost their lives on this hill in June 1916. We climbed to the top of the hill, which had been plowed by shells, where the fort stood, and tried to trace the path of Lieutenant Kiel, who, with about 40 grenadiers, had advanced to the center of the fort through the eastern moat on July 2, 1916. We soon gave up this endeavor. Nothing could be found in the dug-up earth. In this place, man's propensity for destruction had changed the face of the earth. In our imagination, we pictured the dark shadows of the grenadiers advancing, breaking through the hurricane fire and the breach in the outer wall of the moat. We imagined German sappers using flamethrowers against the embrasures from which fire was being directed, and neutralizing the gun crew in the armored turret. Today, that armored turret lay shattered at our feet. As I told my soldiers about the situation in which the French garrison found itself, I thought I could hear the deafening roar of French artillery trying to suppress the German grenadiers who had taken the fort. In the dark corridors of the fort, we found traces of fire on the walls and ceilings of the casemates, and learned the effect of German flamethrowers. Shocked, we stood by the cistern, which was partly responsible for the fall of the fort after 3 months of fighting, and vividly felt the agony of the French soldiers dying of unbearable thirst. But the Germans who took the fort on June 7th found themselves in the same situation. Sweat and blood were on every bottle of water that made it into the fort, passing through a storm of fire and metal. Visiting this historic site turned my comrades into silent listeners. Without uttering a single word, they surrounded me as I told them about the heroic battles of June 8, 1916. On that day, the French attacked 7 times in an attempt to recapture the fort. But the exhausted Germans fought like madmen. They were not going to surrender the fortress they had taken at the cost of so many lives. At dusk, we passed a group of 21 soldiers and 2 German officers who had broken through the French barrage and reinforced the defending force. They were the remnants of 2 German companies. All the others had remained on the battlefield. Under cover of night, our vehicles moved eastward. Visiting the battlefield made us more cautious. Verdun taught us that, despite having survived 2 campaigns, we had not yet experienced the terrible hardships that our fathers had endured. Formation of the Reconnaissance Battalion in Metz. On July 29th, we settled in a fort in Metz. The fort was located west of the Moselle and offered a view of the picturesque Moselle Valley. In the fort, we discovered old batteries of German Krupp cannons from the early 20th century. There was even ammunition for them. It was stored, neatly arranged next to the cannons. The inventory list of the cannons was also of German origin. German artillerymen were forced to surrender these cannons, as well as the lands of Lorraine and Alsace, conquered by Prussia in 1871, to the French in 1919. After much hard work and effort, we managed to adapt the fort to accommodate troops. The fortress was to become a training camp for the newly created reconnaissance unit, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Since August, the Leibstandarte regiment has been deployed as a brigade. I was entrusted with its formation in August. The basis of the units could be formed from the 15th Motorized Company, a platoon of armored vehicles, and a platoon of motorcycle couriers from the former regiment that were at my disposal. I was allowed to select additional personnel from the motorcycle battalion of reinforcements. I did not have to search long for volunteers. The young motorcycle riflemen wanted to join the combat units and were happy to leave their rear barracks. Excellent, strong young soldiers surrounded me as soon as I asked if there were any volunteers. These were young men who had just turned 18 and had been soldiers for only 6 weeks. Within a few days, the new battalion in Metz was complete and began an intensive training program. The young men were up to the task. They enthusiastically followed their instructors' instructions and became a team as tough as steel. The old battlefields became a training ground for motorcyclists and armored vehicle scouts. In the years since Germany's defeat in World War II, a great deal of nonsense has been written about the Waffen SS, and especially about its composition. I think you should get an idea of the origin and social composition of a typical SS unit. As an example, I will quote an excerpt from the registration log of the 2nd Motorcycle Company of the Reconnaissance Detachment, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Before being drafted, the soldiers were engaged in the following professional activities. Technical professions, 42%. Trade, 22%. Individual labor activity, 14%. Agriculture, 7%. Unskilled, 15%. The average age of the soldiers was 19. The average age of the non-commissioned officers was 26. In total, the unit had 450 brothers and sisters. All regions of the Reich were represented. It is fair to say that these troops represented a cross-section of German society and were neither a unit of the offspring of important persons nor mercenaries. 48 officers, Non-commissioned officers and soldiers of this magnificent company were killed in the 6 months from July 10th to December 31st, 1941. During the same period, 122 were wounded. In the heavy defensive battles near Rostov in December 1941, the company's strength was reduced to a platoon. How dare today's public figures call these honest and self-sacrificing young men party soldiers? These guys fought for Germany, and of course did not die for the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which ruled the country in those years. In the fall of 1940, I was sent to a training course for staff officers in Alsace. The chief instructor of the course, Lieutenant General Biller, commander of the 73rd Infantry Division, was an excellent specialist. During my training, I met a couple of colleagues with whom I would later experience several serious situations in Greece and Russia. At that time, the units and divisions of the Leibstandarte were practicing Operation Sea Lion and training in amphibious landings. The Moselle River was a favorite place for training. Under conditions of secrecy, the training shifted to conducting combat operations in mountainous terrain. We rode motorcycles at breakneck speed down the steep slopes of the Moselle Hills. The area surrounding the fortress with its high walls and moats looked like a circus. We even trained in climbing and descending rocks with motorcycles and anti-tank guns. By spring, we expected to be a well-trained unit, ready for combat in any conditions. Soldiers, non-commissioned officers, and officers worked with heavy weapons as a single team, coordinated like clockwork. Colonel General Blaskowitz praised our efforts in his speech. General von Kurzfleisch expressed similar sentiments when we were inspected in Metz for the last time. The unit was ready for action and awaiting orders. That's all for today. If you like the video, please support it with a like and subscribe to the channel. See you all soon.